All right. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning from the Philippines. Welcome, everyone, to the lecture Gender, Climate, and Disaster Resilience Challenges of Equity and Sustainability of the Coastal Cities at Risk and the National Resilience Council Lecture Series. This event is organized by the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines Investing in Climate and Disaster Resilience Project, the Ateneo de Manila University, and the National Resilience Council, in partnership with the Gender Research Center of the Visayas State University. Our session today is broadcasted live on Facebook on the pages linked on your screen. That's facebook.com/Sicar in the Philippines and fb.com/resiliencecouncil.ph. Please be guided by today's house rules. All attendees and participants are automatically muted upon entry. The ceremony will be recorded for documentation purposes. For our panelists, please keep your video off and your microphone muted, especially if it's not your turn to speak. For our attendees on Zoom, you may send your questions through the Q&A option found at the bottom of your screens, so our team can note this and raise it during our open forum. Likewise, for our attendees on Facebook, you may comment your questions on the comment section, and our team will be collecting this for the open forum. So we begin this webinar with opening remarks from our co-conveners. Starting from Ms. Antonia Yulo Loyzaga, the President of the National Resilience Council. Ms. Loyzaga is also the co-principal investigator of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project, and she is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Manila Observatory. Ms. Tony pre-recorded her introductory messages today, and we are truly grateful for her for partnering with us and leading this conversation. So let me just play this video.
Yes, good morning. This is Tony Loyzaga, and I thank Ina for making this recording possible. Good morning, Ems. Good morning, Dr. Licuanan. I was a student of yours many years ago. Good morning, Dr. Resurreccion. Babette and I have known each other since we were, I would say, in grade school. And good morning, Attorney Santa Maria, our distinguished panel speakers and reactors, including Mayor Beng Climaco. I'm coming to you today because of a very tight schedule, and I really apologize for not being able to be there. Our Executive Director of the National Resilience Council, Ms. Malu Erni, will be there to actually provide some closing remarks at the end of the day. Let me just start by saying that we are no experts in this field, and we're here to learn. And I'm here to present basically where we're coming from at the National Resilience Council. The Resilience Council has basically adapted a framework, and we are saying that moving from risk to resilience requires thinking across sectors, along different disciplines, different decision-making levels. And we look at resilience here as a matter of linking leadership and governance that is based on evidence and empowering stakeholders, but also the 5 pillars that you see present: human development, local economy, infrastructure, environment, and human security. We locate gender in the human development pillar, but in truth, it is embedded across all the different pillars. And for us to achieve the kind of impacts that we want in terms of the work that we do, we need to include gender across all pillars. And that goes in for the environment, especially the local economy, infrastructure, and of course, human security. I should say here at this point that we're very privileged to have Mayor Beng Climaco with us, a very prominent world leader as far as being a mayor and being a woman. And it is through her intercession that we actually included a human security pillar in the resilience framework that you see today. So at the National Resilience Council, we view disaster events and disaster risk as potential opportunities for transformation. We take off from Maniena of Northumbria University, wherein he actually discusses how disasters are an opportunity to rearrange power relationships in a society and therefore provide opportunities to bounce forward. In the case of today's event, what we'd like to do is bounce forward together and, in fact, recognize that gender based vulnerability, gender based exposure should be part of that transformation. We base our work on three grounded agreements: the Sendai Framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement. All of these are embedded in the design of the work that we do with resilient local government systems. And what we'd like to do is learn more from you in terms of how we might be able to, in fact, address specific vulnerabilities and exposures that are related to gender. The program that we have consists of 3 years. We are at year 2 for the most of the local governments that we now work with. And here we're looking at how we can improve existing systems to reduce vulnerability to hazardous events. The National Resilience Council is not a relief organization. We are working on risk prevention, and that means recognizing vulnerability where it begins, exposure where it begins, and reducing that in order for the impacts of disasters to actually be mitigated. And this is where we would like to learn from all of you today. How power is shared in the barangays, in the local governments, in informal and formal economies really can reshape risk. And in order for us to bounce forward together, we do need to recognize this specific exposure and vulnerability characteristics. Gender being among those factors that actually put people in harm's way. And we'd like to, in fact, move together with you to build that culture of prevention. Understanding the physical and social geographies of risk. And here I use the words of of Dr. Emma Porio. The intersecting physical and social geographies is a very complex and transdisciplinary endeavor. What we'd like to do is cross disciplines, learn from experts, learn from communities of practice, and in fact intersect the work that we're doing with the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you see here, I put gender equality right up front. We were using this slide in an earlier event, and in fact, we've actually included gender equality today because of my increased awareness due to Doc Emma's work. I put also COVID there as an image because, in fact, public health is particularly involved in the protection of women and children and the differently abled. What we'd like to do is bring a new focus to public health, nutrition, maternal and child care, as well as women's health, to all the different dimensions of the work that we're doing based on the Sendai framework. So we hope that we can do this together. One of the questions for this event was really, how do we interrogate the intersections between gender, climate, and resilience? Frankly, I do not have the answer. We're working on this together with you, and we'd like to learn from you today. My last slide really builds upon what I just said earlier, understanding the physical and social geographies of risk and resilience. There was a Grant Thornton survey last year wherein the Philippines was cited as among the countries with the most number of female CEOs. And yet we do have situations wherein among the most vulnerable, economically, socially marginalized, are women that are living in the different coastal and rural areas, women living in urban infills, really having to cope with not only providing for their family, but also with issues relating to their own health and identity. And what it takes in terms of what we believe will be the pathway to resilience is a leadership and governance that is evidence informed and gender sensitive, as well as that which is open to understanding all of these complex interrelationships between the physical and the social. And I put Mayor Beng's image here because she has been one of the standard bearers for this type of leadership. This is an image from a typhoon in September of 2020, wherein, in fact, there were special arrangements made certainly to undertake COVID prevention, but also to undertake the protection of women and minors. And here we salute Mayor Beng, and we hope to learn more from her and to support her work even further. On that note, thank you very much, Doc Emma. EMS, we have been working together since 2011, but really since 2003 on how to house the poor in the city. And today, I'm very proud to be part of your work and very privileged to be part of your work in terms of understanding the intersection between gender, climate, and resilience. Thank you very much, and we wish you a successful discussion today.
Miss Tony Yulo Loyzaga would also like to acknowledge Miss Jessica Bercilla for sharing the image of Nanay Maria and for the extraordinary work that she has done after typhoons Ondoy and Yolanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Tony. Thank you to Miss Magru for that. I now introduce next our co-convener of this webinar, Dr. Emma Porio, who is the project leader and principal investigator of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project. She is also a professor of sociology at the Ateneo de Manila University and the Science Research Fellow of the Manila Observatory. Without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Emma Porio.
Thank you, Ina. Can I share screen, please?
Yes, Doc Em.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Tony, for this very generous remarks. I think Tony and I have been working on um, flooding and prevention and research in Metro Manila for the last 10 years, and so I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that Tony and the National Resilience Council has been partnering with us. So thank you, Malu, and thank you, Tony. Good morning and welcome everyone to the second lecture of the Xikar Page National Resilience Council lecture series for 2021. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone here in the panel which made this possible. Number one, Tati Licuanan brought us the whole Gender Studies Committee to Beijing for the Beijing conference. I'm very grateful for that, Tati. And then in 1997, she made Attorney Santa Maria and I and Attorney Candelaria and whole other people do the trafficking in women to Europe. And that was 1997. 1998, Tati asked us to do trafficking in women study to Japan and many others. So it's with Tati Licuanan that really I owe a lot. And in fact, I was just telling her a while ago that the Master of Disaster Risk and Resilience that we created in 2017 would not have been, implemented had she not intervened and helped us pass it through the bureaucratic channels. So thank you, Tati. And of course, I'd like to thank Attorney Ampi for inviting me to teach gender and human rights in gender and environmental rights and gender and climate justice in the graduate legal studies program. Thank you very much, Ampi, for inviting me and work with you. And of course, to Dr. Bernadette Resurreccion, thank you very much. In November 2011 and 2019, we had a conference in Arete on bridging science policy practice nexus on investing in climate and disaster resilience. And Dr. Resurreccion was so generous to us to fly from Bangkok to here to show us how to do intersectional analysis in climate and resilience and gender. So I'm very grateful to Babette for, I was just telling her, for putting the method into intersectional analysis and introducing it to both scientists and practitioners in November 2019. So I'm very grateful for her that she, even though she's now in Canada, she still support us here today. And of course, Mayor Beng, I can never forget, your conference in, again, September 2019 in Zamboanga. And I really saw there about when we say gender, generation, and geographies of social and political power, Zamboanga demonstrates it. Thank you very much, Mayor Bing. And Mayor Bing has also been supporting us in the National Resilience Council and CCAR-PH on our series of seminars. So thank you very much, Mayor Bing. And of course, Tess Tabada, task, Tess has been doing a lot of work on sand and gravel mining and in Leyte, and I was telling her that that is where sea level rise and other climate effects and gender really intersect. So thank you very much, Tess, for allowing me to push you and say, can you do this together? So thank you very much. So why is it that we decided, I emailed Tati Licuanan in November. That was the time of Rolly and Ulysses and COVID like that. And I said to them, let's have a talk on gender and climate disaster resilience in March. It will be the opening salvo of the Women's March Month. Because I really think that in the studies of climate and disasters, women is sort of treated in a silo. And I think it is here that when we talk about gender, climate, and disaster resilience, equity, and sustainability challenge, it is where these issues are very much interrogated. So let me just present to you some few images that I think would tell us that really we have to think about women, climate, and the disasters because as I was saying last Friday in our seminar on equitable resilience, I was saying that I feel like we're like Sisyphus. When the floods come, the rock falls down. After the floods, we push again the rock. And I think it's like that. 20 typhoons visit us every day. But every time the typhoon comes and the floods come, it's almost the same. So this is Ondoy, Marikina, and 209, and this is Ulysses, 2020. So on your left is Ondoy, 10 years ago. On your right is Ulysses, 2020. And in Yolanda, you can see here the women, the elderly women, and the children, and in disasters. And so in SICAR, in our work, really, I always say that to understand the exposure to floods and the vulnerability to floods of women and other vulnerable groups, we have to look at intersectionally the exposure, vulnerability, and adaptation and resilience initiatives of people at the policy level and also at the ground. And I always say that you have to look at the social, geopolitical, political, economic, and cultural forces at the macro level. And then you have to look at the meso and a micro level, and you have to look at it vertical and horizontal interactions in terms of gender, generation, and PWDs. You have to look at their livelihood basis, their capacities, and their capabilities of education, health, housing security, their services, and most of all, I'd like to say, social capital and trust networks with their local officials, with NGOs are very crucial in terms of lowering their vulnerability and promote their adaptive capacities and resilience. We did this in 2012 or 2010 after Ondoy, and you can see there the summary of costs and losses due to floods. You can see that women really suffered more in terms of their children having absences from school, the number of work days lost, and also in the number of the average income losses, as well as the amount spent on medicines and the average losses in appliances and the like. So women always paying more, yet they are not responsible for the climate impacts, yet a meteorological event like flooding and all that stuff, women will-headed households suffer most. Here also I put together I used this presentation last night in Porto Alegre. You can see there the summary of COVID infections and displacements due to climate events in China, in India, Bangladesh, in Ecuador, and the Philippines. So we always say that, the COVID-19, a biological hazard, collides basically with flooding, strong winds, and the like. So we're basically saying in the SICAR-PH and National Resilience Council, we're saying that we have to work, we have to interrogate the vulnerability and capacity of women in terms of the community level. So here, this is our work in Muntinlupa with Dean Wing here and Pilmon. We work with the NSTP program of Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Muntinlupa, and with the CPDO, and with the DRMO, and also later with GAD, wherein we basically thought about doing participatory community risk assessment so that people, men and women, will know what are the hazards in their meds and how they might be impacted. This is also the site that I work in, Kamanava, and we were really saying that COVID-19, climate, and the poor women and children are really very much affected. So you can see here, Anna has been working with me as a field worker since Undoy. And this area here, they were displaced by Kitsana in 2009, relocated from the Tolihan River lines in 2017. So you can see these are their houses, the relocated area. But during Ulysses and COVID, um, the the housing authority dismantled some of their areas at the back, wherein the children, if you can see there, the children can only get strong signal at the back of their house. So they put a tarpaulin just in case. But the housing authority said those are illegal structures. Also, she lives with her parents, and so there in total there are, I think, around 10 people living in one household. And so you can see that and during Ulysses, this is what happened to their houses. And also, she lost her job selling pandesal, because as you can see here in the bottom, they were only allowed under lockdown. They can only go to the market 5 to 8 a.m., 8 to 10 a.m. They have to be locked down and the like. So COVID-19 and plus the floods and the winds and the typhoon really quintuple the negative impacts on the poor children, women, and elderly. So I would say, we have to care. Each of us have to care for some space. We have to look at what we can do in terms of building the capacity of the women and community to respond in a preventive manner, not like, we just, you know, uh, whenever the typhoon comes, okay, there are relief goods and the like. We have to work with them in terms of really trying to build their capacity, like what we're doing in CCAR-PH, teaching them how to do mapping, a gender-based mapping, so that they can protect their spaces and their households. So the reason why we say that, because I think it's only in investing in preventive and mitigative things that we can be resilience driven. So I'd like to call attention, for example, here in this UNDRR panel, you can see that of the top 15 countries with highest exposure to hazards and to risk, it's really Philippines is number 3, Japan is number 4. In the second column, the countries with highest vulnerability worldwide, both Japan and Philippines are not there. We're not that highly vulnerable compared to other people. But in the third column, wherein you see that the countries with the highest risk worldwide, you will see that Philippines is there again, but Japan is not there, because Japan has invested in building resilience model kind of investing in building the capacity of the people. So that's why I would always say we must invest, as Tony was saying earlier, we must be risk informed and resilience driven in terms of how we analyze, how we design our programs, how we formulate our policies, and how we implement them on the ground. So I would like to close by saying I'd like to introduce what I say the men and women of the coastal cities at risk in the Philippines, investing in climate and disaster resilience. As you can see there, we are partnering. So our project holder is Father Jet and now Father Bobby. The principal investigators is Jessica Bercilla, who is with Christian Aid, now based in Iloilo, and of course Tony Licuanan, who are always supporting SICAR PH and Manila Observatory. I'm very grateful for that. And we have our international advisors, Hassan Verji and Gordon McBean, who used to be the president of the International Science Council. You have Rajib Show, and you have recently of Taiwan, and of course we have our pool of experts, and we're partnering with three cities: the city of Naga and Iloilo, and Muntinlupa, and Pasig and Valenzuela. So, of course, I wish I met Mayor Bing when I wrote this proposal. I would have wanted Zamboanga and CDO to be also our partner. But we will continue to partner Mayor Bing through National Resilience Council. So thank you very much. I'd like to now turn the floor to Ina.
Thank you, Dr. Emma, for your opening messages. Now we officially begin our webinar by introducing our first keynote speaker, Dr. Patricia B. Licuanan. Dr. Licuanan led the main committee that negotiated the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, held in Beijing, China, 1995. She's also the former chairperson of the Commission on Higher Education in the Philippines. With her lecture entitled Gender and the Environment, Promises Made, Promises Broken, let us welcome Dr. Patricia Licuanan.
Good morning. Yes, I have titled my presentation, Gender and the Environment, Promises Made, Promises Broken. It has been over 25 years since the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, held in Beijing, China in 1995. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action that came out of the conference remains the most comprehensive and progressive global blueprint for women's rights and empowerment. The Beijing Platform for Action is significant to our webinar today because it was the first international document that explicitly emphasized the intersection of gender and the environment. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, or the Earth Summit, held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, acknowledged women's role in the development of sustainable and ecologically sound consumption and production patterns and approaches to natural resource management. And this was reflected in the outcome document, Agenda 21. But it was the Beijing Platform for Action that identified women and the environment as one of its 12 critical areas of concern, specifically spelled out the main aspects of this relationship, and laid out strategic objectives and recommended actions for governments, the United Nations and multilateral agencies, non-governmental organizations, and other actors. I like to recall how in the early discussions of women and the environment as a possible critical area of concern, in the close to 2-year process of negotiating the platform, a not uncommon reaction was, what has gender got to do with the environment? But eventually, at 5 regional preparatory meetings in Jakarta, Vienna, Mar del Plata, Amman, and Dakar, most of the regional platforms included environment as a critical area. And in the preparatory meetings in New York, and finally at the conference in Beijing, women and the environment was accepted as a critical issue and was in fact not among the most hotly contested and debated areas. I would like to review today the main points raised in the Beijing Platform for Action. Why, you might ask, would I be focusing on a 25-year-old document? Well, because today, 25 years after it was approved by consensus at 4:45 in the morning of September 15, 1995, the platform and its 12 critical areas of concern provides an invaluable framework for understanding the challenges faced by women today and addresses the very issues we are discussing at this webinar on gender, climate, and disaster resilience. The Beijing Platform for Action solidified attention to women's leadership in environmental issues, making clear that their full and equal participation leads to better governance and conservation outcomes, and it provides a crucial map moving forward. For starters, it is important to stress that the critical areas of the Beijing Platform for Action, their strategic objectives, and recommended actions were premised on the following principle. Can I have the first slide, please? The advancement of women and the achievement of equality between women and men are a matter of human rights and a condition for social justice and should not be seen in isolation as a women's issue. They are the only way to build a sustainable, just, and developed society. Empowerment of women and equality between women and men are prerequisites for achieving political, social, economic, cultural, and environmental security among all peoples. In assessing, could I have the second slide, please? In assessing the situation of women vis-a-vis the environment, the platform makes three main points: the impact of the environment on women, the role of women in the management and use of natural resources, and the absence of women at all levels of policy and decision making. Thank you. You can remove the slide. I'll discuss each of these aspects one by one. First, the impact of the environment on women. Changes in the environment affect everyone, but these impact more on women than on men. Um, did you remove the slide? I'm sorry.
Yes, yes.
At the most basic level, mortality rates are greater for women than men in times of natural disaster. This gender discrepancy has been validated in a number of major disasters, such as the Asian or Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricanes Mitch, Katrina, and other storms of the Americas, European heat waves, cyclones in South Asia. Also, Emma's earlier slides show this. The vulnerability of women to disasters is increased for a number of reasons. So why? In disasters that require mobility, such as cyclones and floods, uh, where they have to get out quickly, cultural constraints may hinder their escape. Also, they may be put in harm's way as they protect children and the elderly. Post-disaster, women are at risk, are at higher risk because they are placed in unsafe and overcrowded shelters. The deterioration of the environment results in negative effects on the health, well-being, and quality of life of the population at large, but especially girls and women of all ages. Environmental degradation causes displacement of communities, especially women from income generating activities, while greatly adding to unremunerated work as they face greater challenges securing water, food, and fuel for cooking and heating. Climate change has serious ramifications for food security as traditional food sources become more unpredictable and scarce. Deforestation has meant that wood, which is the most widely used solid fuel, is located further away from where people live, and women and girls who are responsible for collecting traditional fuel in most developing countries have to walk further distances and become more vulnerable to injuries from carrying heavy loads long distances. Girls are sometimes even kept from school to help gather fuel. Environmental risks in the home and workplace may have a disproportionate impact on women's health because of women's different susceptibilities to the toxic effects of various chemicals. These risks to women's health are particularly high in urban areas, as well as in low income areas where there is a high concentration of polluting industrial facilities. The second point made in the situation analysis in the platform is the role of women in the management and use of natural resources. Through their management and use of natural resources, women provide sustenance to their families and communities. As consumers and producers, caretakers of their families, and educators, women play an important role in promoting sustainable development through their concern for the quality and sustainability of life for present and future generations. Women have often taken the natural lead in promoting an environmental ethic, reducing resource use, and reusing and recycling resources to minimize waste and excessive consumption. Women can have a particularly powerful role in influencing sustainable consumption decisions. In many communities, women provide the main labor force for subsistence production or subsistence agriculture. Furthermore, women, especially indigenous women, have particular knowledge of ecological linkages and fragile ecosystem management. In certain regions, women are generally the most stable members of the community, as men often pursue work in distant locations, leaving women to safeguard the natural environment and to ensure adequate and sustainable resource allocation within household and community. The third point in the situation analysis is the absence of women at all levels of policy and decision making. Women remain largely absent at all levels of policy formulation and decision making in natural resource and environmental management, conservation, protection, and rehabilitation. Their experience and skills in advocacy for and monitoring of proper natural resource management often remain marginalized in policymaking and decision-making bodies, as well as in environment-related agencies at the managerial level. Women are rarely trained as professional natural resource managers with policymaking capabilities, such as land use planners, agriculturists, foresters, marine scientists, and environmental lawyers. And even when they are trained, women are often underrepresented in formal policy making institutions at the national, regional, and international levels. The next slide, please. To address these realities, the Platform for Action laid out three strategic objectives with corresponding recommendations and actions. And these are the promises made that I was referring to. The first strategic objective is involve women actively in environmental decision making at all levels. So some examples of the recommended action for this strategic objective are ensure opportunities for women, including Indigenous women, to participate in environmental decision making at all levels, including as managers, designers, and planners, and as implementers and evaluators of environmental projects. Another example of a recommended action for this first strategic objective are facilitate and increase women's access to information and education, including in the areas of science, technology, and economics, thus enhancing their knowledge, skills, and opportunities for participation in environmental decisions. The second strategic objective in the platform for action in this chapter is integrate gender concerns and perspectives in policies and programs for sustainable development. And some recommended actions are integrate women, including Indigenous women, their perspectives and knowledge on an equal basis with men in decision making regarding sustainable resource management and the development of policies and programs for sustainable development, including in particular those designed to address and prevent environmental degradation of the land. A second recommended action is evaluate policies and programs in terms of environmental impact and women's equal access to and use of natural resources. A third strategic objective is to strengthen or establish mechanisms at the national, regional, and international levels to assess the impact of development and environment policies on women. And some examples of recommended actions are provide technical assistance to women, particularly in developing countries, in the sectors of agriculture, fisheries, small enterprises, trade and industry, to ensure the continuing promotion of human resource development and the development of environmentally sound technologies and of women's entrepreneurship. A second example, develop, and this is quite relevant to this group today, develop gender sensitive databases, information and monitoring systems, and participatory action oriented research, methodologies, and policy analyses with collaboration of academic institutions and local women researchers on some of these following areas: knowledge and experience of women on management and conservation of natural resources; two, impact on women of the environment of environmental and natural resource degradation; and analysis of the structural links between gender relations, environment, and development. The next slide, please. Since Beijing, the UN has held regular reviews of the implementation of the platform, Beijing +5, +10, +15, and +20, and most recently, Beijing +25. These reviews revealed disappointing results, far short of the ambitious goals of Beijing. National reports show varying degrees of implementation in four main areas shown in the slide. First, integrating a gender perspective into environmental, climate, and disaster risk reduction policies. Examples of this would be a growing number of states reported mainstreaming gender equality considerations into their climate policies, such as those on low carbon development. Some countries have developed and are implementing climate change gender action plans, under which women are seen as active agents of change. A second main area of implementation that countries reported on are, is building climate resilience among women. And examples of these would be some countries reported improving women's access to and control over land, water, energy, and other natural resources. Some countries reported allocating 30% of newly developed areas to women in order to promote their participation in agriculture. A third major area of implementation is reducing the impact of natural disasters on women and girls. Some examples from country reports are strengthening the evidence base and raising the awareness about the vulnerability of women and girls to environmental degradation and disasters. Also, programs supporting the livelihoods and health security of women and girls in disaster prone areas. A fourth and final area that came out in the country reports is promoting women's participation in environmental conservation, protection, and rehabilitation. And examples are sectoral gender strategies and action plans for increasing women's participation in decision making at the local level. Also, countries reported setting minimum quotas for women's membership in protected area management boards and water committees. Thank you. Can we remove the slide now, please? So as we can see, there were areas of implementation, but despite these, the global and regional trends are unmistakable. Since 1995, the environmental crisis has intensified with devastating impacts on the most marginalized, that is, women and girls. Women still bear the brunt of coping with climate related shocks and stresses and health effects of pollution. Environmental degradation continue to have serious impact on women's access to, use of, and control over land and other natural resources around the world. Women and girls' access to public services and sustainable infrastructure is compromised by environmental degradation and climate change. Women's participation in climate-related decision-making and intergovernmental climate negotiations has increased, but remains far from parity. Excuse me. For example, between 2013 and 2019, their level of participation as delegates to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change rose from 29% to 38%, partly as a result of the implementation of the framework's Gender Action Plan through awareness raising, training, and capacity building activities. Globally, more attention has been paid to women's right to work and their rights in the workplace, the issuance of unpaid care and domestic work. All very important, but strengthening women's participation in environmental sustainability and gender responsive disaster risk reduction and resilience, and digital and financial inclusion have received the least attention globally. It is intriguing to note that progress from early questions on what gender has to do with the environment to wide acceptance of the intersection of gender and the environment has not translated into more prioritized action for women. Negotiations at UN meetings on women, such as, such as at UNESCAP, have recently focused on issues such as the extent of the climate crisis, with some strong objections to the use of the word crisis, climate justice, and climate refugees, with tensions between developing and developed countries. It must be pointed out, however, that these issues do have deep gender implications. So, after 25 years, the vision of Beijing has only very been partly realized. I have spent a good part of the past year with Beijing on my mind, pushing for a recommitment to the promises made in Beijing, the fast tracking of the implementation of the platform, the discussion of new and emerging issues, and the development of champions of the platform across generations. So at this webinar and to this audience, I make a similar appeal to recommit ourselves and act quickly to involve women actively in environmental decision making, to integrate gender concerns and perspectives in policies and programs for sustainable development, to strengthen or establish mechanisms at the national, regional, and international levels to assess the impact of development and environment policies on women. I urge the discussion of new and emerging issues such as climate change, disaster resilience, climate justice, and yes, the complexities of intersectionality, which were not yet central in Beijing. And I welcome with enthusiasm young feminists taking an increasingly visible and active role in calling for economic, social, and environmental justice and demanding a more just and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tati, for your lecture. To the audience, you may continue to send in your questions through the Q&A option found on your screens via Zoom. For our listeners via Facebook, please send in your questions using the comments section of the live stream. Now let us welcome our second keynote speaker who will discuss about applying a gender intersectional analysis to climate change. Dr. Bernadette P. Resurreccion is an associate professor and Queen's National Scholar of the Global Development Studies at the Queen's University in Canada. She's a former research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Asia, and in 2019, Dr. Resurreccion was awarded with the Mary Franmeer's Gender and Disaster Award. Without further ado, I now hand over to Dr. Bernadette Resurreccion.
Thank you, Ina. I'll just share my screen. Can you now see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Good morning to everybody and greetings, warm greetings from Queen's University here in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It really is my pleasure to be with you today. And I thank very much Dr. Emma Porio and her team, her fantastic team, who's invited me to be part of this very important event this morning. I am truly inspired by what Dr. Licuanan, Dr. Tati Licuanan has shared with us. And I think it really provides a really inspiring start for this morning. And I would like to take this opportunity to actually share with you some of the thinking with regards to understanding why is it, for instance, that women, certain groups of women are persistently negatively affected by environmental disasters, climate change, and other types of disasters, including COVID-19. And for this morning, I thought of sharing with you the thinking with respect to understanding or positioning gender in climate change through a specific lens, and that is what we call to be a gender intersectional lens. I will start my presentation with an example. This is Sonia Maribel Sontay Herrera. She's an indigenous woman. She's not from the Philippines, but actually she's from Guatemala, and she's a human rights defender, where there has been a lot of discrimination against indigenous women that has gone for decades. And I think this is not very different, for instance, from our own ethnic and indigenous groups in the Philippines. So at 10 years old, she moved to the city to attend school, having the opportunity that most indigenous girls do not get. However, Sonia was forced to abandon her native language, which is Quiche, to learn Spanish, which she experienced as an unjust burden for an indigenous woman, her language not being recognized. Since for her and for many of the indigenous peoples, it was the language of the colonizer. After finishing her studies, Sonia searched for professional work. She immediately encountered racism and sexist stereotypes. Since she was an indigenous woman, some said that they only had work for her at home. They see us as domestic workers, says Sonia. When they see an indigenous woman, they assume that's all we can do. She explains, outlining the ways in which she experiences compounding several forms of discrimination based on her identity. And this is what we refer to as an intersectional phenomenon. What then is intersectionality? So intersectionality as a concept is not very new. It was actually coined in 1991 by an American lawyer, a critical legal race scholar by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. And basically, intersectionality has raised the concern over Black activists and feminists, as well as Latina, post-colonial, queer, and indigenous scholars that have actually produced work around intersectionality. And therefore, they reveal the different factors and processes that shape human lives. In a nutshell, intersectionality promotes an understanding of human beings as shaped by the interaction of different identities. Here we often refer to them as social locations. For instance, a person can be identified in a compounded way according to his or her race or ethnicity, his or her indigeneity, his or her gender, class, sexuality, geography, age, disability or ability, as well as perhaps migration status and religion. So we are not just women here or men. We are compounded by different social identities and locations. Now, these identities actually occur within a context of connected systems and structures of power. For instance, certain laws, certain policies, certain state governments and other political and economic unions, religious institutions, as well as media can be responsible for creating this compounded discrimination and sense of identities. Through such processes, we find that there's not just only marginalization, but there are also forms of privilege shaped by different types of, shall we say, attitudes and processes such as colonialism. Historically, colonialism has created hierarchies of individuals. I remember, for instance, years ago, researching on the Philippines, I did work on indigenous groups in Northern Luzon. And I found, for instance, in the American archives under the American period, that the Philippines was actually divided according to different ethnic groups. And this was primarily based on which groups actually embraced Christianity and were lowland people. They became the majority population. And those who lived in the uplands and were less receptive towards Christianity became the minority population. So colonialism was one way with which people became hierarchicized. And as a result, there were marginalizations and discriminations that came to be. Applying it now to climate change research, and I suppose this is really where I'm coming from, since I am a researcher on climate change and gender, and looking at the kind of history of the knowledge around gender and climate change research. In the past, shall we say in the early 2000s, in climate change research, gender was constantly being seen as a binary, a kind of men versus women formulation or understanding. And there was a kind of homogenization of men, that men were all the same and that women were all the same. Increasingly, research has shown us that it's much more complicated than that. It's not just women and men as two opposing groups, but rather it's much more complicated in terms of who women and men were, in terms of their identities. There were increasing realizations, for instance, in climate change research, that people's vulnerabilities as well as their exclusions, their experiences of exclusions and disadvantage in climate change programs that Dr. Licuanan so eloquently described after 25 years of the Beijing Platform of Action, are actually resulting from multiple factors and processes that link up systems of power, and much of which I already earlier mentioned. This next slide actually demonstrates much more specifically how vulnerability is linked to inequality. In climate change research and in climate change discussion, there's always a focus on vulnerability and how people, and I think Tony Yulo in her introduction actually did mention how people are actually exposed, especially groups who are very poor, who are actually exposed to climate change, and therefore they are vulnerable. What we're saying in this slide, that vulnerability is actually very much linked to issues of discrimination, issues as well of marginalization, and this compounds vulnerability. And much of this discrimination and marginalization is also linked to the compounded identities of people, whether by gender, whether by class, by ethnicity and race, by sexuality and disability. These inequalities are manifested through their intersecting identities, and they are historically and culturally constructed, meaning they are not fixed, they continuously change, and they are pretty much constructed over time. So as also Dr. Emma Porio has pointed out, and Tony Yulo earlier, marginalized communities such as women, indigenous women, women in rural areas, young girls, girls living with disabilities, or transgender youth are the most impacted by natural disasters and the devastating effects of climate change. And this is not a coincidence. There are explanations to why these groups are often most affected by climate change and by disasters. And the next slide actually tries to sort of explain this intersections, the intersections of factors and causes. For instance, when you look at either a situation of power or privilege, people identified with privilege or people identified with power, or people who are actually marginalized. It is always useful to be sensitive to these hierarchies between people, the differences between people, asking ourselves when we do this type of research on climate change, who are the marginalized and the privileged? The second part, the green part, after that little white circle, actually asks questions of, these are the people who are discriminated against. These are the people who are marginalized. Perhaps the next useful question to ask is, what are their intersecting identities? They're not just women. They're probably women coming from a particular ethnic or indigenous group. They're probably women coming from a particular class or economic strata. They particularly women from particular geographical location, or who are actually also uh, have their own sexual identity or sexual orientation. So these are some questions that help us understand further their marginal status. Also, the blue circle shows us what are the forms of discrimination that actually some people experience. So here you have the different forms of discrimination, such as racism, such as heterosexism, sexism, classism. We bring them all together in this very useful wheel diagram, which really poses important questions regarding inequality and vulnerability. And when we talk about individual forms of discrimination, here we're referring to assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors that actually stem from conscious and unconscious personal prejudice. With respect to institutional discrimination, here we think of forms of discrimination in different institutions, such as, for instance, in education, in healthcare. Often today, for instance, at the time of the pandemic, health equity is a large issue. And we find that inequalities are actually come out to be much more visible at the time of the pandemic. In the justice system and in religion as well, are there forms of discrimination that are being felt? So this is what we refer to as institutional discrimination. What then is systemic discrimination? Systemic discrimination is when forms of discrimination pervades many or majority of institutions. One example is assigning spaces to marginalized peoples, such as with no substantial public services like water, health, or electricity. And possibly these places and spaces may be susceptible to constant flooding. We find that they are the same people who are being affected and marginalized. The last part of the wheel asks the question, what types of wider systemic power perpetuate their marginalization and privilege? So here, this is the bigger picture. What are, let's say, the socio-political and economic processes that continue to fuel all these types of discrimination, that continue to fuel the marginalization of people with certain compounded identities? So this wheel was actually, there's been a lot of representations of intersectionality, but I find that this wheel diagram represents the intersecting factors and actually tries to, at a glance, show us the very complex way that they can all interact. Right, the next slide is applying intersectionality analysis to climate change context in a more focused way. These are, shall we say, some suggestions and some recommendations on how to apply this type of analysis. So first, for instance, if you're studying a climate change phenomenon, find out how a local system works, whereby you find, for instance, a situation of drought or a situation of flooding. Find out the local social and economic systems and how they function, livelihoods of the people who are affected, their land use practices. Are there any extractive practices, like, let's say, mining or other extractive practices? How are resources being used? What is the historical, social, and political context? What are the climate change conditions and their effects? I think many of you would already be familiar with that. Attention to gender and intersectional identities as they link with socioeconomic climate change and dynamics. So this part will actually provide a socioeconomic and political landscape, as well as who the actors and institutions are involved in this particular context that, that you may be studying. And most social scientists would be familiar with that. The second panel asks us to identify the marginalized and how their marginalization is actually sustained. I said often in this presentation that marginalization is often persistent. So we should provide explanations why this is so, and we should be sensitive on how this is actually being manifested. Attention to how people self-identify, for instance, is one indicator. Attention to how they may be silent, they may self-exclude, they may even avoid interaction due to fear or to shame. How many times have we actually found this in our field sites? There's obvious inequity, for instance, in their access to opportunities or to benefits. I remember, for instance, a former colleague who was part of the United Nations Environment Program in the headquarters in Nairobi. And he often told the story that when he used to do rural field work in the rural areas, he would knock on somebody's door to try and sort of interview the people in that household. And one time a woman opened the door and he said, his question was, is anybody at home? And she opened the door and she said, no, no one is at home. That reveals to us how, let's say, women in this case actually represent themselves. They continue to represent themselves as also invisible. So the third panel asks us to clarify institutions, norms, and narratives that also sustain marginalization, which may be global or national in scope with long-standing overt or tacit relevance. For instance, racism, ethnic identity, patriarchy, or sexism. We can also we can also experience how, for instance, how strong patriarchy is in a community when, for instance, women are huddling together and avoiding mixed groups or public discussions with men. Each community has its own norms and structures of power. How sensitive are we to these norms? Of course, once we do our intersectional analysis, that is then a basis for which we can collaborate within and among subgroups to build or coalesce with others whose voices are also muted or silent, especially in the face of, shall we say, powerful actors. And finally, an intersectional analysis offers a more specific or deliberate treatment of policy change, in the sense that it alerts us to groups whose voices are not heard. And these approaches, intersectional approaches, can better assist us in designing policies, first in identifying the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, as well as their needs and their interests. They make us aware of the unequal effects of power structures that pervade and that continue to be persistent, and therefore aim to change them over time. So these are some examples of intersectionality. I won't read them all. I just want to, let's say, point out the last one, an analysis of flooding in Bangladesh, for instance, where Farhana Sultana from the University of Syracuse actually showed that women are not homogeneous with regards to the experiences of floods. However, their relations to class, to religion, as well as age, younger and older women, affect their resources, their rights, as well as their responsibilities. For instance, she found that poorer rural women were particularly vulnerable to floods and natural resources, and they often experience limited access to resources as well as to recovery. But men were also not homogeneous. Their experiences during disasters were also influenced by their own class, by their own religion, as well as by their own educational status. So this is my almost last slide, and just wanted to point out and take it a little bit further by saying that international and intersectional analysis also asks, how are climate change problems framed? How are they understood? And here, often we ask, what types of knowledge is privileged in dealing with climate change? I'm reminded, for instance, that again, with my friends in UNEP, in the United Nations Environmental Program, it was only 3 or 4 years ago that they had a gender specialist in their program, according to them. And it just tells us how much certain types of knowledge are being privileged with respect to solutions and responses to climate change. So gender experts themselves as a kind of identity, in a sense, is marginalized when it comes to climate change science and climate change solution seeking. And I'm reminded of what Dr. Licuanan actually said here, that, you know, what has gender got to do with environment? And to respond to that question, we just came out with a book last December. It's called Negotiating Gender Expertise and Environment and Development, Voices from Feminist Political Ecology. It is actually downloadable in that link. So feel free to download it and to also see how we are struggling within the environment landscape and the environment space. Just wanted to share with you this quote, which actually captures intersectionality. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? All equality is not created equal. From Kimberly Crenshaw. I leave you with that cartoon and illustration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Babette. That makes me very excited for our open forum later. Can't wait to hear from our attendees and guests. Now for our final lecture, we bring to you Attorney Amparita Santa Maria, who leads the Graduate Legal Studies Institute of the Ateneo Law School and the Urduha Women's Desk of the Ateneo Human Rights Center. With her lecture entitled Interrogating Gender, Climate, and Disaster Resilience into the Law School Curriculum, let us welcome Attorney Santa Maria.
Thank you, Ina. Can you put on my PowerPoint? Yeah. Before I go further to the next PowerPoint, I'd like to thank Doc Emma for inviting me and my co-panelists. My talk is actually about integrating gender, climate, and disaster resilience into the law school curriculum. And this, I'm talking about the Ateneo experience. And hearing my co-panelists before me, you can see that if you want to teach gender, climate change, and disaster resilience, they've already provided a very substantive contribution to the possible content of what you're going to teach. So let me just share that, of course, according to UNESCO, education is an essential element of the global response to climate change. Climate literacy enables people to understand and address the impact of global warming and also encourages changes in their attitudes and behavior. Accordingly, education and awareness raising also, one, enable policymakers to reach informed decision making. Two, play an essential role in increasing adaptation and mitigation capacities of communities. And three, empower women and men to adopt sustainable lifestyle. Even in the Sustainable Development Goals, uh, goal number 13 on take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, one target is to improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change, mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning, for which one of the indicators is the number of countries that have integrated mitigation, adaptation, and impact reduction and early warning into primary, secondary, and tertiary curricula. So for the Ateneo Law School, let me just give you an overview. Next slide, please. So if you look at what the law school should teach, it is the Supreme Court that prescribes generally the areas of law which are covered in the bar exam. So it's sort of mandatory that these are the things that you should study. And at a glance, it seems that the topic of gender and climate would be really difficult to locate in this subject, these subjects. Next, please. So in 1991, Ateneo Law School shifted from the LLB program to JD program. So what does this mean? It means that there was a change in curriculum. Aside from students having to defend a thesis, there were electives also which were introduced. And one of the electives that was first introduced was human rights. No? So it's kind of gave us a window also to introduce issues which are not specifically related to the bar, but it's a social justice issue. Okay, next please. And then in 1993, you have the Legal Education Board, which actually prescribes the basic curricula for all law schools. No? And from an elective, they prescribe that human rights should be a core subject. So the advantage was that all students now would have to take this subject, and it would no longer depend on whether it will be closed or open depending on the number of students. Next slide, please. So there are three approaches which we're doing. No? First is to introduce separate course on women's right or gender, okay? Because naturally, when you have a gender course, you will have the different issues which should be tackled, and later I will discuss the addition of the climate change. The second is to conduct separate sessions on gender, climate, and disaster resilience issues in other courses that may provide this opportunity of introducing these issues. And the third would be special projects where students and faculty alike have the opportunity to engage or encourage to write papers on gender, climate, and disaster resilience. Next, please. So the first is introduce a separate course on women's rights, gender and the law. I introduced this course in 2002. So it was initially offered 11 years after the JD program was granted. So at this time, most electives were on corporate and business law. Okay. So we have one session on gender and climate change, and you can see there the purpose of this session, the objectives of this session. Now, the next approach, next slide, please, would be to conduct separate sessions in courses that provide the opportunity to introduce this subject. So in 2014, the Ateneo Law School became part of the master's degree program of Mahidon. It's a global campus program called Masters in Human Rights and Democratization. which is the Asia Pacific chapter, and together with 4 universities, including the Ateneo Law School, we introduce 2 subjects which are taken both by students coming to the Philippines to take the second term and our JD students, and it can be taken even by our Master of Laws students. So that would be the critical and emerging issues, human rights issues in the Asia Pacific, and human rights norms and mechanisms. At the same time, climate has also been integrated some in some other electives like evolving norms of business responsibilities for human rights, which talks. There's a session talking about linking companies' operation with specific issues such as climate change and sustainable water, for example, and human rights. Okay. Next slide, please. So for the critical and emerging issues, norms, and mechanism, as Doc Emma said earlier, she's handling gender equality, environmental rights vis-a-vis climate change, climate-induced internal displacement. And another professor is teaching also human rights-based approach to climate. That would be Doc Emma. No? Gitna. Climate-induced internal displacement is taught by another professor. And two of these courses that you see on the screen are taught by Doc Emma. Okay, next slide, please. And the third approach would be special projects where faculty and students are encouraged to write or to research also papers on gender, climate, and disaster resilience. We also entered into special project with Raoul Wallenberg Institute on a blended learning course on climate change, disaster, and displacement with gender and human rights-based approach. And you can see there the purpose or the objectives of this special project. Next slide, please. So these are the in progress research and training modules which are being developed. We are just at the beginning stage, and some of these sessions are actually handled by the Graduate Legal Studies and also by Doc Emma. So for my last slide, or second to the last. So what are the challenges? It's difficult to integrate. So as of now, we're just trying to look at every space where we can actually inject gender and climate change. Because in core subjects, for example, inclusion of climate issues with a gendered lens is not always guaranteed. Sometimes it also depends on the faculty who is teaching, because core subjects are generally bar subjects. Now, in electives, which are more focused on women's rights or which modules are designed to be taught with a gendered lens, the students are also limited to 18 to 22. There's a cap. So that was the advantage of the human rights course, where it became a mandatory course. So everyone took it or is taking that course. But for electives, you only get like maximum of 22 students per semester. So my last slide is just our mantra with the Ateneo Human Rights Center, which the women's desk, the Urduha women's desk I had, to learn the law, serve the people. So with that, thank you very much. And I conclude my short presentation.
Thank you very much, Attorney for your presentation. Now we move to the panel of reactors. Now let me call our moderator for this session, Dr. Emma Porio, to also introduce our first and second reactor for today.
Okay.
Emma.
Thank you, Ina. We first welcome Mayor Bing Climaco, Mayor of Zamboanga City, to give her or share with us her initiatives in Zamboanga City and in the region in terms of gender and human security. Mayor Beng, thank you very much always for supporting us and working with us at the National Resilience Council and here at the CCAR-PH in Ateneo de Manila University. Thank you, Mayor Beng. It's your floor.
Okay, maybe we can ask Ma'am Tess to go first. Ma'am Tess, are you available?
Yeah. Okay. Mayor Beng is in another meeting, so let's have Maria Teresa Tabada of the Visayas State University. She heads the recently established Gender Resource Center and formerly director of the Institute of Strategic Research and Development Studies. Her job basically, and that's why I asked her to speak here, is to make university like hers a more gender responsive institution. Tess, go ahead. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to wish everyone a happy Women's Month. And I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Coastal Cities of the Philippines and the National Resilience Council for believing in and supporting the efforts of the VSU Gender Resource Center to build a more gender responsive university. So as I go along, I will raise the insights that I gained from the three lectures this morning. So allow me first to start. Next slide, please. To introduce to you the Visayas State University. We have a vision, a globally competitive university for science, technology, and environmental conservation. I added there the gender responsive, as we are in the process of coming up with our GAD agenda and the formulation. Part of the GAD agenda is the formulation of a gender responsive vision. So we hope that this will be articulated eventually. And in our strategic goal number 2, which is a globally competitive science and technology, one of the objectives really is to gear our research agenda towards issues of global importance such as climate change, renewable energy, poverty alleviation, gender and development, health and peace. So even today, there is already an appreciation, understanding of the importance of embedding climate change, investing in climate change research, and in gender and development. The question there is how are we really able to put in gender in the research agenda? You know? So that is the challenge ahead of us. So some examples of next slide, please. Some examples of the work that we have done. We started out actually our GAD program was a literacy program in the late 80s. Eventually, we have been able to come up to a level where we are able to comply with the administrative and legal mandate set out by the law, the Philippine Commission on Women, and even the CHED through the CMO Memorandum Order Number 1 Series of 2015. And then, in addition, we have already some programs and projects like next slide, please. Okay, so we have a Women and Men in Society program, which was based in the institute, and it was really looking at small studies, no micro narratives from the countryside, looking at women entrepreneurs, women gardeners who were also entrepreneurs, looking at the issue of the mga no phenomenon or women who were girlfriends of basically look for foreign men who would provide the monetary needs that they used to help their families. So we were able to document those things. So that, and then another program of the university, next slide please, Farmers Business School, which the Philippine Root Crops Research and Training Center has implemented since 2012, no? Involving the women farmers by teaching them skills that will add value to the products they produce, no? Especially root crops, cassava, sweet potato, yam, etc. So and then giving them the skills like learning how to run a business so that they're really able to contribute, to the households and to the larger community as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I go back to the question of Dr. Licuanan, what does gender have to do with the environment? Uh, Reflecting back on what we have done here in the university, as I mentioned already earlier, we have done some of these programs that have been more of complying, with the requirements. But now we realize that there really is a need to look at gender and how do we put in gender in all the work that we do. So um, I was sharing in our dry run earlier last week was that the question before was, why do we do gender? I mean, what does it have to do with the environment? But lately, after being able to comply and getting more and more of our faculty and staff to understand why gender has to be included, and why it is important to use a gender lens in the work that they do. The question now has really been, how do we do gender? How do we do gender? So the presentation of Dr. Licuanan really provides a framework. In fact, it's for me, the term I use would be nakonsensya ako because realizing that this was there already, but I didn't really, go deeper into it, and which would have made life so much easier for those of us who were working um, on gender, no? And so this provides a framework really on, how do we do work environment? Why environment? Because the university has said that one of its visions is really, for environmental conservation. Okay, and so the other thing is, so the more important question now has been, how do we do gender? And so uh, the presentation of Dr. Resurreccion has really been it has been an eye opener and very helpful in being able to frame now the questions and being able to frame how we will do gender in our research and our extension and community engagement programs. No, SHED requires us to set up uh, gender responsive curriculum development, gender responsive research and development program, gender responsive extension program. And so this is this is a method that we can all use because we have always equated gender with simply the number of males and females and had difficulty going beyond that. So now we are provided with a method, we are provided with a way of looking at the work that we are doing in gender and seeing how it can in fact impact more and more men and women simply because we are able to see beyond the surface. We are able to go deeper and see what this really means. Next slide. Okay. So I just like uh, it was mentioned earlier that I do work with sand and gravel, and so these are some of the images. The one on the extreme of left, my left, is really this is actually a woman with her family, women actually from the barangay washing in the river, no, and then you notice that there's really uh, it's there's very little water left. No? There's only water when there's floods. That's why they built those structures. And the other side of the river actually is ongoing extraction of sand and gravel. And if you go a little further, you will see the extraction that's being done. And then on the right, you see some of the images of sand and gravel extraction. I chose this because, as you see, the river uh, serves many purposes. For the women, it's for washing, for bathing, opportunity for chismes, this sharing experiences. This is a location for them, no, to be able to do these things. But at the same time, for those who have the resources, and then you are able to extract it, it's very lucrative simply because Leyte sand and gravel is premium. No? It's being extracted because it comes from volcanic soil, and so it commands a very high price in the market. But you see how it has impacted. I've not even reached the at the end of this, you will see the sea, uh, and then let me just next slide, please. So that's just an example, no, of how we can bring in gender and the issues of inequality uh, uh, can be better under can help us better understand this issue of natural resource extraction. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, the presentation of Dr. Resurreccion is really very helpful in providing that intersectionality to be able, as Dr. Porio said, not to recast and examine the new inequalities stemming from fundamental inequities, the social, political, and economic system. So, rural, urban, gender, generation, and geography, political, economic, social, and cultural geographies of resources, basis, and power. I think because of climate change, because of poverty that we see, and because of the loss of unregulated extraction of all our resources, we really need to be able to contribute to that discourse in terms of policy, in terms of data, so that local government units can actually make informed science-based decisions. No? So what is it for the university? No? Last slide, slide please. Yeah. So I added there's a slide that's missing. One, well, is interrogating, as you said, interrogating all these issues of gender and power inequalities. Second is what I learned from the presentation is that we really need to invest. No, we really need to invest in structures and technologies that are uh, that are resilient, that will help that will empower communities. And then the third is that we need to uh, also invest, building resilient structures and technologies. And then we need to uh, our research and extension programs have to be viewed from a using a gender lens, system-wide uh, approach so that we are able to really focus on issues building resilience, building equitable and sustainable communities and societies. And finally, I'd echo what Dr. Licuanan said at the end of her speech. We need to recommit ourselves to that ideal of a just and sustainable future, which means ensuring that we we are protecting the only common home that we have, as Pope Francis has said. So the duty of the university is quite clear, and we hope that we are up to this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Tess. I would like to call back Dr. Emma to introduce our next reactor for today. Dr.
Okay,
Emma.
thank you, Ina. Our next speaker, we're so privileged and we're so fortunate to have Mayor Beng. She's like any other great women, multitasker, and doing so many things. I wish we are like the Indian goddess with nine hands. Okay, so thank you very much, Mayor Beng. It's now your floor to share with us your initiatives in Zamboanga City for women. Thank you.
Daghang salamat, muchas gracias, Doc Ems. Desde Ciudad de Zamboanga, buenos días a todos. Paz de Dios y abrazo de Nuestra Señora la Virgen del Pilar a todos. San Jose, assalamualaikum, mabuhay sa lahat ng ating mga kababaihan on the start of International Women's Month. Our deepest gratitude and congratulations to our keynote speakers, Dr. Tati Licuanan, Dr. Bernadette Resurreccion, and Atty. Amparita Santa Maria, Dr. Emma Porio, Ma'am Tony Loyzaga, and Ma'am Aurora Tabada. I am with Jasmine Muhammad Sali and Garnet Francisco, our millennial partners in this endeavor of our advocacy for women's rights. This has been a very enlightening and an eye-opening discussion on gender equality as well as sustainability as we celebrate Women's Month today. My grandmother, Isabel Cortez Climaco, championed the right of women to vote and be voted upon. And I was a Magna Carta author in Congress where I was part and championed Republic Act 9710, the Magna Carta of Women. As a woman in politics, I'm very much aware that I work in a man's world. I am only the second female to hold the highest elective position in Zamboanga City, and only 4 out of 20 women are elected citywide. For a city almost over a century old, we're 84 years old, these numbers highlight the gender bias in politics and in Zamboanga City. Toxic masculinity is also potent in politics. I have been degraded and belittled for showing emotion and expressing my love for Zumba. In 2004, I was single and was running for vice mayor, and my opponent chose to attack me for being a woman, saying that I was already dried up. All of us here have faced these kinds of discrimination in our respective fields and positions. If existing systems and structures of power allow such abuses on women with a fair amount of privilege, what more on women who are marginalized, discriminated, oppressed, and those who do not have a voice. I agree with our esteemed speakers on the need to have a gender and organic function ingrained in a society as a whole, to look at it holistically. It should be more than just a documentary requirement or a component that needs to be complied with. For as long as discrimination and marginalization and antiquated gender roles and norms are imposed both women and men, we need to push forward the agenda of gender with a sense of urgency. In Zamboanga City, we have worked in addressing these concerns while being particularly sensitive to cultural traditions and norms of different Christian, Muslim, and Lumad communities. Security, health, and education are our priorities, and if you look at the acronym, it is SHE. But if you remove the S, it becomes HE. Thus, we have gender, fair, and equitable community. Capacity and skills training on entrepreneurship and finance, comprehensive anti-discrimination ordinance in Zamboanga City passed last year. Amended Gender and Development Code with salient features uncovering SOGI and Local Council of Women, establishment and production of training center for women, and support to local government initiatives, representation, and inclusion in governance. We have 7 women department heads in Zamboanga City and out of 18, mainstreaming of gender sensitivity orientation seminars. The challenges of equality and resilience, in particular to women, have always existed, but these are brought out even more during times of catastrophe and disasters. This brings into light Dr. Resurreccion, Atty. Santa Maria, and Dr. Licuanan, which presented to us society, government, and the systems of power in place of repeatedly fails to recognize gender as an encompassing issue that affects everyone. It repeatedly fails to include gender in governance, in planning and policy, in decision-making, effectively removing women from the equation. We have seen firsthand the physical, emotional, economic vulnerabilities of women during the Zamboanga siege, which show displacement of hundreds of thousands of families to camps and transitory sites. We see it today again in the ongoing challenge of COVID-19, where women become victimized again as staying at home. In Zamboanga City, COVID-19 further impacted women on isolation, economic disparities, and lack of social protection systems that led to an alarming trend of women radicalization towards violent extremism. Women, mothers, wives, sisters are recruited as suicide bombers, and this developed a trend that is alarming. A woman from Indonesia was identified as a bomber together with her husband, and after being neutralized, gave birth in Zamboanga City. As mayor and regional chair of the Peace and Order Council of Region 9, we are pushing for specific interventions such as a conference on women, on mothers, to undertake the issue of violent extremism. In fact, as I shared with Dr. Emma, we are planning to hold an international forum on this. My takeaway here today is on how we must reshape the narrative that society has imposed on women for us to be able to break the cycle of oppression and exploitation and abuse. It invites further introspection on privilege and on layers of discrimination, oppression faced by vulnerable groups, particularly the IP women. Indeed, we long for the day when there is no longer a need to bring up the matter of gender because it is already ingrained in our system, in our way of thinking, and in our way of life holistically and systematically. So, muchas gracias y vaya con Dios a todos desde Ciudad de Zamboanga.
Thank you, Mayor Bing. Ina?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor Beng. Thank you, Doc Emma, for this. We are actually running out of time, and unfortunately, we do not have questions from the group. So, shall we proceed to closing messages, Doc Emma?
Um, Thank you very much, Ina, and thank you very much, Mayor Bing, and to all the panelists. I am greatly humbled with your expertise, your insights, your knowledge, and directing us what we should be doing, for the next how many years in order to create a more resilient, sustainable future for women and children and the elderly and all the vulnerable populations. But before I call on Malu to talk in behalf of Tony, I'd like to call on Jessica Bercilla, faculty at the University of Visayas, Philippines, and also my co-principal investigator in coastal cities at risk together with Tony Yolo. So, Jack, are you there?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you
He's
very
at
much
the
for the
beach.
opportunity. So very briefly, because we're running out of time, just like to share with you that yeah, during Yolanda, we met several women who were actually in the coastline, less than 48 hours after Yolanda struck. And one of them was trying to look deep into the sea and trying to find ways and means by which to salvage undergarments that they can find because they have nothing. When we met another woman, she went and asked her and appealed to her, what is it that we can support them for? And then they requested that they'd only want to have their livelihoods back, just pots for their cooking. The third one was a woman asking for um, a bar of soap, so she can feel like a woman again. And all these actually informed us that there are very special needs, of women and men that we need to address now beyond the current frameworks that we now see. And I hope that this very engaging discussion has supported the work that it will support the work that you will continue doing here in Iloilo. We're pursuing that in many areas of our coastal work, especially in partnership with the city government and the University of the Philippines in the Visayas. So with that, I thank Dr. Emma and the team for organizing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jack. I mean, thank you for coming here. I did not see you until later, and I said, my God, my co-principal investigator is there. So before I call Malu, may I ask the panelists again to say, your final message for us? Can we start with Tati? Final message, 2 or 3 sentences.
I, I don't have any final message except to repeat what I said earlier, that, you know, we've been talking gender and the environment for over 25 years. We are, as we view what has been done over this period, there have been gains, but unfortunately, uh, the gains have been far short of the ambitious goals that we set many years ago. So right now, the need is not really to reinvent the wheel, but really to just stick to commitments we have made. These aren't
Yes.
new, and I always say that I have to accept the fact that some things go with the season, what is fashionable, and so forth. But there have to be some of us who just stick to it and just say, okay, this is what we said we would do. Let's just do it.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Tati. Can we now hear from Dr. Bernadette Resurreccion? Babette, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again to everybody, Emma, as well as Ina. Thanks so much for making all this possible. The only
Thank
thing I'd like to
you.
say, I guess, is to echo what others have said, and especially what Dr. Licuanan has reminded us, is really to sort of be vigilant with pushing the gender agenda in environment, in climate change, in disaster resilience. I think we really need to learn from the past. And now, especially when after so many years of climate change research and climate change policy making, there are now real solutions. There are now real responses. There are now green solutions and clean responses. But let us also remember that what is green and clean may not always be just. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Babette. I really appreciate all your messages. Can we hear from Attorney Santa Maria, please?
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity, Doc Emma. And as a member of the academe, gusto ko lang sabihin na it doesn't have to be big steps right away. You can actually integrate gender and climate change and be creative kasi yun nga we're the ones pushing. When they say puro gender kayo, ano ngayon, no? Don't stop. Don't stop kasi marami pa talagang issues, and even if you do something outside of the academe, try to integrate your research in the readings, in the material, so that, you know, in whatever way we can integrate our own studies and our own advocacies sa education, that would be already worth contributing. So don't
Okay.
stop. Yun lang.
Yeah.
Happy Women's Month.
Okay. Thank you, Ampi. I will violate the rule of Ina. We were supposed to end at 11, but I really would like, to call again Mayor Beng and Tess to give 2 sentences. What should we do in the next, so that we can create a future that is good for us.
Yes, what we need to do is really to realize that this is really a very holistic society. We
Yes.
cannot just plan and say there is a budget for God, period. It should be
Yes.
working together holistically with the agricultural department. I'm talking from the perspective of local government. When you
Yeah.
talk of gender, it has to be very inclusive, that it incorporates a streamlined policy that makikita mo saan ginagamit tong fondo at para kanino. And
Yes.
always remember that despite of our advocacy for inclusivity of women, that we should not leave the men out. I'm very
Yes.
particular about this because I realize that through the advocacy na nakikita natin, malaking tulong talaga if we have a holistic picture of what we need to do and ensure that development is present from agriculture, from social services, up to technology. That's my takeaway po.
Thank you, Mayor Beng. Tess, two sentences. Then Mayor Beng, do not go away. We will have a picture taken again after the. Okay, Tess, 2 sentences.
I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. I was here to learn. I learned much, and I hope that all of us who are listening, especially those in the state universities and colleges, will will have takeaways that we can implement in our own universities.
Okay.
If we want a better world, we have to work for it. And the framework, the method, even the basis like human rights have already been laid for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I call on now the Executive Director of the National Resilience Council to say closing remarks in behalf of Tony and the National Resilience Council. Malu, take it away.
Thank you, Doc Emma. I'll just make this short. On behalf of the National Resilience Council, I would like to express my appreciation to SICAR PH, led by the very passionate, the highly energetic Dr. Emma Porio, for putting a spotlight on gender, climate, and disaster resilience. You know, today's conversation is indeed a fitting celebration of the International Women's Month, focusing on women in leadership. This has truly been a very engaging, insightful, eye-opening learning opportunity. We are deeply grateful to our speakers and reactors for their brilliant presentations and the exchange of ideas. I also learned a lot from the presentations. Doc Ems, we are also happy that you featured two of our major program partners, Zamboanga City Mayor Ben Climaco, who leads the way for us in better understanding the intersections between gender, culture, marginalization, peace, and security, and her having emphasized the need to reshape the narrative on gender. Professor Tess Tabada, our academic partner from Visayas State University for the city of Ormoc, and once again emphasizing the need to have a gender
You're muted. You're muted.
Hello?
Yeah. Okay. Now I can hear you.
Was I muted since the start?
No.
Just
Just,
now.
just
Okay.
now. Yeah.
Today's conversation highlights a recent UNDP report on gender, climate, and disaster resilience, and I quote, "Women are differently and disproportionately affected by climate change and disasters. At the same time, women are powerful agents of change, well placed to identify and adopt appropriate adaptation strategies and mitigation techniques, and they can be strong advocates and contributors to climate action and sustainability. From our end at the National Resilience Council, as we continue to capacitate our partner local government unit partners towards resilience building, which is done in partnership with our academic partners and our experts pool, we need to strengthen and refine our interventions and integrate a gender lens across all pillars, as presented earlier by Bistoni Yulo Loyzaga. In the case of Muntinlupa City, for example, the lead person of gender and development is an integral part and very active member of the Muntinlupa Resilience Council. And this is one excellent opportunity for an even closer collaboration with the city's DRRM department, the City Planning Office, the City Environmental Office, Social Welfare Office, among others, as well as with the pamantasan ng lungsod ng Muntinlupa. It has truly been an inspiring conversation with our speakers and reactors today. I must say that the journey to climate and disaster resilience is a shared responsibility. NRC is one with you in our quest for equity and sustainability. Let us push the gender agenda and let us bounce forward together. We look forward to the next CAR-PH webinar on gender, climate, and housing. Maraming salamat. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Malu. I'm glad that you you see that we researchers, we have to work with you and the people on the ground. So thank you very much. I learned a lot today, and I'm really happy that we put this all together, and I hope we will continue to work as they say, we must bounce forward together. We must create a beautiful future for us, because if we don't do it, who will? I mean, so they always say, if you want something done, give it to a woman. So it seems like we are reinforcing the patriarchal, here. But really, I think in terms of gender, climate, and justice, I think we really have to insert. And I'm so happy that Attorney Ampi was saying that, you just don't have to do some, just focus. As Tati said, focus. Just do what you want to do. So for us in academe, put it in our teaching and research and extension programs. And for those like Mayor Beng, insert it in the programs that they're doing. So thank you very much. By the way, guys, we've reached so many people. There's even, people as far, in CDO, Iligan, Zamboanga, Visayas, and even as far as Bahamas. Somebody from Bahamas came to listen to us and thank us. So thank you very much. We've reached people. Before we will close the Women's Month in the last week of March with a presentation on gender, climate, and housing. We will have Mayor Marian Ocampo, who was our speaker last Friday. She says she's very much interested in participating on gender and housing. We will have Dr. Caraos on her post-disaster Ulysses assessment of Kasiglahan and Southville. We will also have the housing advisor from the We Effect in Sweden. So, and also with some of the partners here in the Philippines. So stay tuned to us. For some of you who've been asking for certificates, we will do that. And also we will put this in our website. So we will also put together all the presentations in an ebook. And please subscribe to the websites of the SICAR PH and the National Resilience Council, and we'll send you a copy. So all of this will be documented so that hopefully in your own part of the world, you'll do something for ourselves and for this earth and this planet to be a better place for all of us. That's our responsibility. So thank you very much. Tati, Bladette, Ampi, Tess, and Mayor Bing. Thank you very much.